Let's get right to MSNBC's senior White House reporter Vaughn Hilliard in South Korea, Reuters White House correspondent Jeff Mason, New York Times trade and economics reporter Anna Swanson, and former CIA and State Department official Ned Price. So, Vaughn, the president really hyped this meeting and the expectations going into it. But it sounds like some major details still have to be ironed out and some major topics weren't even addressed. Walk us through the deliverables.
Right. I think it's notable that in China's statement coming out of this meeting after President Xi left South Korea, that they lacked really any details. There was not even a single mention of a trade deal coming anytime soon. President Trump said upon leaving South Korea that he believed that a trade deal would be struck pretty soon. So exactly what are the details? Is this on paper? What does that actually look like? There's a lot of question marks, but let's tick through the other agreements according to the American president. He said that China agreed to, or that the U.S. agreed to reduce the still mightily high tariff rate on China by 10%. So it now stands effectively at 47%. He said the U.S. agreed to allow certain chips and semiconductors to be exported to China, though notably saying he'd authorize NVIDIA to have direct talks with China, except for Blackwell chips. He also said China will resume, quote, tremendous amounts of U.S. soybean purchases and other farm products, as well as begin U.S. energy purchases. To note, it's not clear the extent of those commitments, whether for ag products, it's effectively a truce to return to pre-trade war levels. And even then, it's worth recalling that China fell short of its ag buying commitments back during Trump's first term. Trump also said that China will again allow for, quote, openly and freely the movement and exports of critical rare earth minerals. But exactly which rare earth minerals, that is not clear. Of course, Trump believed that he had had a deal on that earlier this summer before saying that China had rolled back and continued to restrict those rare earth mineral exports anyways. He also said that both sides are going to work diligently to combat fentanyl flow. That's what he attributed the 10% decrease in tariffs to. As for what President Trump said was not discussed, notably, the finalization of the TikTok deal, which he had said would come down to the approval of President Xi. He also said that Taiwan and its independence was also not discussed.
So on a 47% tariff rate, still high. For everyday Americans, what changes at this point?
It is still quite high, and the United States and China, despite their tensions, are still major trading partners. China was the third largest source of U.S. imports last year. So that's still a pretty hefty tax to add on top of imports. At this point, though, U.S. tariffs on imports from most of the rest of the world are pretty high. The U.S. has tariffs of 50% on Brazil and India, quite high tariffs on Southeast Asia. So one interesting kind of legacy of this agreement is that companies may not really feel as much pressure to move out of China anymore to other places. Tariffs on China are high, but tariffs on the rest of the world are high as well. So I think we've gotten to a point here where this is restoring some stability to the relationship for businesses that depend on trade between the U.S. and China. That's very important for them. But a lot of them are asking, how long will this last? Because, as Vaughn noted, some other truces have been struck earlier this year, only to crumble rather quickly.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of Canada, what's happened just recently in that situation. Ned, to come out of this without a TikTok deal, without concrete assurances on fentanyl. In fact, President Trump says we agreed that she was going to work very, very hard to stop the flow. Remember, fentanyl is what really kicked off this entire tariff war, according to the president, his administration. The fact that these key national security issues weren't discussed, what does that tell you?
Well, Anna, in a sense, we always knew precisely how this was going to go and how this was going to end. And I think most disturbingly, so did the Chinese. Let me tell you what I mean by that. This followed Trump's typical pattern. Several weeks before this summit meeting, he created a crisis in a failed effort to generate additional leverage. In this case, he leveled the threat of 100% tariffs on Chinese goods in response to their rare earth export restrictions. He later called the meeting into question. He hurled insults at the PRC and President Xi in particular. But then, as it always does, the climb down started. The thaw began with meetings at lower levels. They were called very good, very constructive. Trump then started to say nice things about China and President Xi once again. And it became glaringly obvious that not only would President Trump go ahead with the summit meeting, he'd portray it as the best ever or something close to it, while importantly failing to address the underlying issues to the point of your question. And that's precisely what happened. China knew that would be the case all along, which means they didn't have to make real concessions. That's why we didn't hear anything beyond a suspension of their rare earth export restrictions. They pressed pause for a year. This didn't solve it. We didn't hear anything about TikTok. We didn't hear anything about Taiwan, as you mentioned. This was always scripted this way. The Trump team knew it, and I think concerningly, the Chinese did as well.
Jeff, any surprises to you? What stands out?
The biggest surprise to me is TikTok, because President Trump has been saying that would end up being something that President Xi would agree to. And he's also been flagging that President Xi had already essentially given a green light to that deal. So I'm surprised about that. I'm not particularly surprised that Taiwan didn't come up in an hour-and-a-half meeting that was largely focused on trade. It's hard to imagine that they would get to every single hotspot, and Taiwan is certainly a tricky one in the U.S.-China relationship. I think Ned is spot on in terms of describing the dynamic. It is, I think, important to remember that just a few weeks ago, this meeting had been called into question entirely. Now it's happened, and President Trump is painting a very rosy picture of what occurred. But obviously, the fact that even though tariffs have been lowered a little bit, but are still at 47%, the U.S. wants to maintain that leverage. President Trump wants to maintain that leverage. And China still has leverage, too, because, as Ned rightly pointed out, the pause on rare earth restrictions is temporary.
Yeah, China coming out of this meeting with a much more reserved readout, while the president's calling it a 12 out of 10 kind of meeting. Vaughn, this was President Trump and Xi's first in-person meeting in 6 years. I'm curious, what was the dynamic after all that time? Does each side trust the other to follow through on these agreements?
Right. A lot has happened, including a pandemic during that period of time. And when the two men left yesterday, those were the first images that we were waiting to see. And President Trump was all smiles, shaking the hand of President Xi. I want to let you listen to President Trump talk first about the potential of a trade agreement with China. And then you're going to hear in the second soundbite, you're going to hear him talking about the rare earth minerals agreement that he says was struck between the U.S. and China. Take a listen.
We have not too many major stumbling blocks. We have a deal. Now, every year we'll renegotiate the deal, but I think the deal will go on for a long time, long beyond the year. We'll negotiate at the end of a year. It's a one-year agreement, and we'll extend it after a year, like we do. It's a one-year deal that will, I think, be very routinely extended as time goes by.
Now, I think the point that Ned was making is an important one, too, is that we have seen little in terms of concessions from China to the Trump administration, either the first Trump admin or the second Trump admin. Of course, during the first round of trade negotiations back in 2019 and 2020, the Trump administration wanted them to make concessions when it came to the state-subsidized market supply and IP theft. We never saw that transpire. And then here, this go around, again, you did not see any concrete concessions that would be able to make the case that this was a better deal than perhaps before the trade war started earlier this spring. And China did, in its statement, I think it's worth noting, say that they urged the U.S. to not fall into a vicious cycle of mutual retaliation. Anna.
What we just heard from the president there sounds like he's talking about yearly renegotiations. Is that sustainable? Is that open-ended situation going to rattle markets and businesses? Anna?
Oh, sorry. That was to me. Thank you. I think that this situation is, quite unstable, as events this year has shown, that, the two sides have come together to create a truce. Something has come up. The president is, of course, kind of famously unpredictable, likes to reserve his flexibility of action. So I think there is a lot of uncertainty uncertainty going forward here. And I would also just note that I don't really see any signs of a negotiation of a trade deal in a traditional sense. I think the president has created a lot of confusion around what the term trade deal means. Typically, these are things that would take years to negotiate, might be dozens or hundreds of pages of legal text that makes changes to laws. Nothing like that has really been occurring. All of the discussion so far has really been focused around these measures that the sides have taken against each other, tariffs, rare earth export controls, and just kind of restoring stability. So I think that really is one of the most notable aspects of these talks, that the two sides are really just not even talking about the real criticisms that the United States has had about Chinese trade practices for a long time.
And sorry about that when I was asking you the question, Anna. I think my mic got clipped initially, so of course you didn't know I was directing it for you. Ned, let me talk about what came before this important meeting. The president announcing that the U.S. would immediately restart nuclear weapons testing. That's something that's been halted since 1992. Trump later saying it, quote, had to do with others, referring to other countries, adding that they seem to all be nuclear testing. Ned, what do you make of the timing, and what are the implications?
Well, we don't know, as usual, precisely what President Trump means, whether in extremis he means resuming atmospheric high-yield testing or underground or underwater high-yield testing, or doing something closer to what the technical experts will call non-zero yield nuclear testing, the likes of which we've accused other countries of doing, including Russia and China. Look, North Korea is the only country that has done any sort of high-yield testing in recent years, and if the United States were to shift from its position and to actually resume any form of testing, you know who would benefit the most, Anna? It's China. The United States has conducted 1,045 explosive nuclear tests since the 1940s. China has only done 45 or so. So they have a lot to learn. We already know a lot. We shouldn't give away our advantage by weakening the norms to which we've subscribed all along here.